From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
One of the iconic moments of the campaign when he was a server at McDonald's, and an Indian American from India said something like, I'm nobody. And he said, you are somebody, you're not nobody. And that was extemporaneous.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, author of a number of books, including the recently revised and re-released The Case for Trump and The End of Everything. We talk with Victor Davis Hanson today for some election analysis and insight. Dr. Hanson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Talking today about some analysis and insight following the 2024 election. And we talked prior to the election numerous times about the shape of the race, Dr. Hanson. After seeing what we saw and the results of November 5th, how did Trump do what he did? This great comeback, one of the greatest comebacks in political history, which you already had hinted at before November 5th, came to fruition when we got the results. How did Donald Trump do it? And how did he make himself more popular than he was just a couple of years ago?
Well, there was two things that were going on. One was what he did, and one what was done to him. And the latter was pretty clear. I think everybody agrees that there were three factors. One, the Biden administration under the leadership of Merrick Garland, it really did wage warfare against him. So the Fannie Willis, the Alvin Bragg, the Letitia James, the E. Jean Carroll, the Jack Smith indictment, civil or criminal, were seen by the general public that they would have never been brought to have Trump, A, not run for office, or B, if there had been any other target. So they were considered lawfare. The mugshot and things like that added to it. So there was a sense that he was being victimized and treated unfairly, and he was defiant in the process. And that kind of characterized the whole campaign. The moderators and the debates were biased. The assassination attempts, there were legitimate questions about the level of proper security, and he showed defiance through all of that. The second thing was that he was not running against his own record, which was good, but he was running against one of the worst presidential records in modern memory, that of Joe Biden. That gave us hyperinflation, no borders, 12 million illegal aliens, disasters in Afghanistan, humiliation, the Chinese balloon, the Middle East. The world was on fire. Crime, the destruction of our cities, et cetera, death. And he was running against a very poor record. And then finally, Kamala Harris must have been the worst Democratic candidate since George McGovern. She had no confidence in extemporary press conferences, town halls, interviews. She could not do them. The manner in which she had been anointed without a convention, she'd never run in a primary in her life. The way that 14 million voters and Joe Biden were disposed of, that all of that channeled into Donald Trump. But then on the other hand, he was able to look at the political landscape and say, I don't really want to appoint people from the political establishment of the Republican Party. The Romney, Bob Dole, McCain, Bush wing is over with, and the constituents that promoted are over with. So I'm going to create, and he had tried it earlier, but I'm really going to double down on a national workers' party, populist party, that's going to replace class solidarity for racial tribalism. So he deliberately went into venues that no Republican would ever go. Black audiences, Latino audiences. He championed the white working class, not the caricatured golf cart aristocratic Republican. He talked in a very frank manner. He brought people that no Republican would ever bring into a coalition. They weren't just Democrats or former liberals, but they were eccentric and they were actually popular. And so they did a lot more for him than the tired old never Trumpers like Liz Cheney did for Kamala Harris. And speaking of Elon Musk, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, and that sort of got this image that he was everyman. You saw it at the Madison Square Garden rally, but again, there's Sunday night when he was around Joe Rogan and Dana White and RFK and Tulsi. So it was sort of every middle class person's particular constituency was molded together by him. Very different from any past Republican candidate.
Dr. Hanson, you mentioned the surge in support among African American voters and Latino voters. It's one of the things the polls actually did predict before Election Day. No one really believed those polls, but it turned out they were true. How much do you accredit that to Donald Trump's outreach and his style of campaigning? And how much do you attribute to the fact that even those on the left after the election are admitting that Democratic governance in our big cities is an absolute disaster? People see the results of Democratic governance and are looking for another option.
Well, I give a lot of credit to Donald Trump because they had been derelict. They, being liberal blue state governors and mayors, they had been derelict in 2016. They had been derelict in 2020, and yet they were getting 94% of the African American votes, 55% of 60 the Latino vote. But what Donald Trump did is he flipped their vulnerability. So he came in and said, "You may be Latino, but this border is destroying your community. You have to have English as a second language and cannot have AP in your course. You have to hire more policemen. Your dialysis clinics are jammed now." He said that to African Americans. He said it to poor whites. He said it to Latino communities, especially in the border. And then he made the corollary argument that your blue state representative and the people you see on MSNBC, NBC, all the media, if you're a Hispanic or black, these people have as much in common with you as their white elite counterparts do to truck drivers and assembly workers in the Midwest that are white. And so all of you people have something in common that transcends your race, and that is you're middle class and you're being ignored and destroyed by these people, but they don't like you. Oprah does not like you, and Kamala Harris doesn't like you in the same way that Joe Scarborough doesn't like you, Chris Matthews doesn't like you. And that was a very hard sell, but it really caught on, and that was why you saw 25% of black voters who were male voted for him, and almost 50% of Hispanics voted for him. And he really did, people don't recognize that he really did well with Asians. It's one of the largest minorities now. He got up to almost 45% after only having about 25. So it was a brilliant strategy. The people around him were really underappreciated. Wild and that team, much different from the 2020 and 16 team.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson with us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, talking post-election analysis and insight. Perhaps we should take a moment and reflect and appreciate the sheer effort put in by Donald Trump on the campaign. He put the work in. Nothing was guaranteed to him about a second nomination. There were contenders. There were other Republican candidates who wanted that nomination. Donald Trump put the work in. Donald Trump went to various communities. Donald Trump asked voters for their support, perhaps those who had never been asked before by a Republican candidate for their support. This is a candidate who is, near the same age as President Biden was when he started his term, but no one would confuse the two in terms of activity. Who do you think convinced Donald Trump to do this? Who are those advisors or people around him who perhaps deserve some of the credit as well as the candidate?
Well, I think the person who deserves the most credit is Susan Wiles. She had been working for a lot of candidates in Florida, successfully so, and she understood the grassroots. And then he had a number of people, Miller and John, and a lot of them around them And they kept reiterating the message that you're not going to win unless you can get middle-class voters, and you've got to work and go out and court them and minority voters. Do not worry about the never-Trumpers. You're not going to bring into your cabinet a Mattis or the Rex Tillerson, and just forget all of that. They hate you. You're never going to win the change back. In fact, you want their anger at you. Mm-hmm. What you want to do is go into these communities, outwork Joe Biden. It was kind of damning in the last 2 weeks where Kamala Harris actually took a day off. And then her campaign, for some reason, released pictures of her napping in the plane while this 78-year-old man was just sleeping 2 or 3 hours a day. And he picked out certain events that they had him, the mixed martial arts things, and then going into bodegas and of course the famous McDonald's and the garbage truck stunts. All of that was laughed off by the left. One of the iconic moments of the campaign when he was a server at McDonald's and an Indian American from India said something like, I'm nobody. And he said, you are somebody, you're not nobody. And that was extemporaneous. And then there was a final thing that he was audacious. He would go talk to anyone, anywhere, about anything, anytime. It was in stark contrast to the scripted and timid approach and attitude that Kamala Harris had to the press and the people.
We'll continue in just a moment with Victor Davis Hanson, more election insight and analysis. But first, did you know there's a brand new Hillsdale College online course? You can find it right now at hillsdale.edu/new course. Paradise Lost is the great long English poem. John Milton's masterpiece is a beautiful, penetrating, and challenging look at human nature, the relationship between God, man, and the angels, and the relationship between men and women. In Hillsdale's new free online course, Paradise Lost, Dr. Stephen Smith takes you through this epic of Western tradition, and you can start for free at hillsdale.edu/new course. In taking this course, you'll contemplate the power of providence, experience life in paradise, dread the impending fall, imagine the war in heaven, discover true liberty, and feel the extent of God's love. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course. NEWCOURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/new course for Paradise Lost, the new free Hillsdale College online course. We continue now with Victor Davis Hanson, Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History here at Hillsdale College. More at victorhanson.com. Dr. Hanson, Democrats in the final days of the campaign made it a priority to attack Donald Trump in the most hyperbolic ways possible. But they were saying the same things they said about him last time, and some of the same things they said about Mitt Romney, and some of the same things they said about John McCain in past campaigns. It seemed that by the end, voters simply didn't believe anything that was coming from the left, that their words had lost meaning. Do you think that there is now a trust gap between the parties, that many moderate, independent swing voters simply won't listen to messaging from the left at this point?
Oh, absolutely. That whole Trump is a fascist, he's a Nazi, he's a dictator. It was unconvincing for so many reasons. People have seen him in office for 4 years. And he really didn't go after Hillary. He said she suffered enough. He really didn't weaponize the FBI, the CIA, the DOJ, the IRS in the way that Obama and Biden have done. And they knew that. So they thought, well, I've seen this guy. He's not a dictator. He's not a fascist. He's not a Nazi. And then they would say to themselves, well, why are you saying this? We don't want to hear that. We want to hear that the border isn't secure and you're going to do something about it, or why we had hyperinflation, and they wouldn't do that. And so that was a sin of commission and omission. They said something that people innately knew was not true. And it was borne out later when Biden had him into the White House yesterday. or Kamala Harris talked to him. People said if he's a dictator and he's Hitler, why would you have him in the White House?
Mm-hmm.
But it was also a sin of omission, because when they fixated on that, they didn't talk about the issues and who she was and how she was different, if so, with Joe Biden. What was her plan in detail to govern? None of that was there. It was just Trump, 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 and it had the unintended effect of giving him more and more attention as someone who was unfairly the object of vituperation, lawfare, etc., made him even more sympathetic.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson with us. Wayne and Marcia Buske, Distinguished Fellow in History here at Hillsdale College. His recent books, including The Case for Trump, The Re-Release, and The End of Everything. Dr. Hanson, Donald Trump enters this second term as a president who is guaranteed no reelection campaign. He can't run again. He has 4 years and he is done. What do you make of the speed with which the Trump administration has to work to make good on some of these promises made during the campaign? What's the window, and do you think that they feel the urgency, again, to deliver on those promises?
Yeah, he's got about 2 years, because he is a lame duck, and people know that he's won a popular and electoral college, he's in control, but he's got to get the right people in there, and he's got to deliver on his promises. And he's got some real paradoxes, because he cannot bring in the Mattises and the Kellys and the Tillersons and all, nor can he bring in the Bannons and the Omarosa. He needs to get loyalists who are really going to cut government and bring the change, radical change he promised. But some of them are going to be so non-traditional, like a Tulsi Gabbard or an RFK, but especially Matt Gaetz. He's going to have to decide which ones can be confirmed as quickly as possible and which ones the Senate Republicans in private will rebel against. Right now, I think there's only one, and that's Gaetz, that they will rebel against. But he's got to get the idea that these people are going to be merciless in the way that they cut government. And then I think it's also important that he's confronted with things abroad that are a mess. The Ukraine war is getting to it. I mean, when Biden just allowed Ukraine to use hypersonic weaponry against the homeland of Russia, it's going to be really tricky for Trump. So he's got to go in there and he's got to tell the people, we're not going to get in endless wars like I said, but I'm going to have to use judicious force as I did getting Soleimani or Baghdadi or ISIS out, or we're going to have no deterrence, and we're going to be in an endless war. And that's very hard to convince people that he's a Jacksonian and will strike, but he's not going to get bogged down in a quagmire. The same thing about the debt. I mean, he said no tax on Social Security, no tax on military people, first responders, police, no tax on tips, etc. And that's great. But when you add that to restoration of tax cuts, you're getting up to $1 trillion a year in lost revenue. So he's really going to have to convince people, I can cut $1 trillion and I can grow the economy, so we'll get another trillion or $2 in revenue, and then we can get on the trajectory that's going to balance the budget. So it's going to be tricky to pull off this renaissance, because he's got some contradictions in the people around him. I think he's going to have some problems with RFK, because he is a liberal, and if he starts to bring in people like Dennis Kucinich and goes after measles or smallpox vaccinations or things like that, it's going to be hard for someone who bragged, and I think deservedly so, that he got Operation Warp Speed for all the problems with the mRNA vaccination. There was some utility there, so we'll see how he handles it. But he's got to move fast.
Final question for Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Barack Obama was often said was great at getting Barack Obama elected, but very bad at getting others elected, especially in the off-year elections. Barack Obama was good for Obama, not so good for the Democratic Party. Donald Trump has proven to be very good at getting Donald Trump elected. Candidates who are emulating Trump's style, and in some cases, his messaging haven't been as successful thus far. Is there a way to turn that into a strength? Is there a way for Donald Trump to help others like him get elected in the midterms?
Yeah, I think there is. The message from the House races, and I think the Senate races, is if you embrace Donald Trump's message of creating a middle-class workers' party, populist party, and you go after the establishment and the waste and the blue state model and the arrogance of the elite, and you're somebody like Sheehy in Montana, who's a veteran, or McCormick in Pennsylvania, or people who almost won like Rogers in Michigan, or Moreno in Ohio, then you're going to win. But if you are like Carrie Lake and you come off as kind of eccentric, or and I'm not disparaging, I think she would have been a much better candidate. She would have been a much better senator than Gallego. But my point is that she came off as shrill, she came off as an election denialist. So she came off as a ultra-Trump person, but not necessarily an ultra-MAGA agenda. And I think that only Donald Trump can beat Donald Trump. And when you try to get fiery and controversial, it doesn't work to the same degree. So get the message and be bold like he is and be unafraid of criticism, but don't get into these cul-de-sacs that she got into, and a couple of other people did as well.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Wayne and Marcia Buske, Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, author of numerous books, including The Case for Trump and The End of Everything. Find more at victorhanson.com. Dr. Hanson, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate having me.
Up next, Stephen Gao Calabresi is with us. He'll tell us about his new book, The Meese Revolution, The Making of a Constitutional Moment. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. You'll find older episodes of this program, plus all the great Hillsdale College audio we have available. We're joined by Stephen Gao Calabresi. He is a professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, a visiting professor of law at Yale, and also the co-author of a new book with Gary Lawson. It's The Meese Revolution, The Making of a Constitutional Moment. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Should mention you also have the great opportunity to work with Ed Meese as a special assistant and also have served with him on the Federalist Society board for many years. So it is a subject which you know a lot about, but it's a subject that our audience might know all that much about. That's why we talk today. And we start with this question very briefly before we get deeper into it. Hey, who's Ed Meese and why should we know about him?
Well, Ed Meese is basically President Ronald Reagan's right-hand man, and he was his closest friend during President Reagan's administration. He was chief of staff to Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1980 and was a key architect in helping President Reagan get elected in 1980. And then during President Reagan's first term, Ed Meese served as counselor to President Reagan and had a seat on the Reagan cabinet. And he was in charge of all policy decisions, essentially, both in national security and in domestic policy during that period. Ed was on President Reagan's National Security Council for almost all 8 years of the Reagan administration, and he was a key architect of the foreign policy, which led to a defense buildup and the winning of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was heavily involved in all aspects of domestic policy, including President Reagan's tax cut. And then in 1985, Ed Meese became the 75th Attorney General of the United States, and he served as Attorney General for the last 3.5 years of President Reagan's term. And he was a path-breaking figure as Attorney General because he announced early in his tenure that he was going to follow originalism in running the Justice Department, and that the department would follow that approach to law in all the decisions it took, and the judges and Supreme Court justices it appointed, in the litigation it brought, and in all other matters. And he really is a revolutionary figure in law. As a law professor of 32 years standing, I've researched all 86 attorney generals of the United States, and I think he is the most influential attorney general in American history, both in terms of affecting the development of the law and paving the way for the current majority on the Roberts Court, the Supreme Court, and also unique in that while he was Attorney General, he continued to run foreign policy and domestic policy for President Reagan. And no other Attorney General has done that except for perhaps Bobby Kennedy for his brother John Kennedy. But of course, Bobby Kennedy was only doing that for 3 years before President Kennedy was assassinated, and Ed Meese did it for almost 8 years.
Right.
So Ed is a uniquely important figure in American history. The reason people don't know much about him is that he's one of the most modest and Christian and humble people I've ever met. And when the meek inherit the earth, Ed Meese is going to inherit all the land west of the Mississippi.
I'm so glad you said that. That's one of my favorite lines. It's in the introduction, I think. I love that line from the Meese Revolution.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I want to kind of start chronologically, but much of the book is about his influence as Attorney General and his influence on the originalist movement in law. But there's also about a third about his influence and work inside the Reagan administration. So I wanted to start there. You say that Meese is associated with every great thing Ronald Reagan did. How did Ed Meese, as Attorney General, become such a trusted confidant and become such an integral part of the Reagan administration and the Reagan policymaking?
Well, it goes back to 1966 when Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California. And Reagan ran for governor of California in 1966 on a policy of getting tough on the campus radicals at Berkeley. And Ed Meese at the time was a prosecutor in Berkeley, and he had arrested 700 students who'd occupied a university hall and had prosecuted a bunch of them. And Reagan was so intrigued that he interviewed Ed and offered him a job. And then Ed worked with Governor Reagan for, I think, 8 years during Reagan's tenure as governor of California, and they became extremely close personal friends. Ed was then chief of staff to Ronald Reagan's 1976 presidential bid, where Reagan narrowly lost the Republican nomination to Gerald Ford. And then he was chief of staff to Reagan's 1980 presidential bid, which, of course, that election he won in a landslide over Jimmy Carter. Ed was centrally involved in key campaign decisions. He brought in Bill Casey to help run the 1980 Republican campaign, and Bill Casey then served as director of the CIA under Reagan and was a key architect of Reagan's foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Ed advised President Reagan on picking a running mate and urged him to pick the first President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, because he was the best and most conservative of the various possibilities that Reagan was considering. And so he entered the White House with just an enormous reservoir of trust on President Reagan's part. And the two of them knew each other so well that they could start telling a story and each of them could finish the story themselves because they knew the ending to it. They just really had a complete mind meld. And President Reagan just trusted Ed on everything. And the staffer who advised Ed on the National Security Council said that whenever there was a disagreement on the National Security Council, President Reagan always sided with Ed Meese. And certainly whenever there was any issue of legal policy, when Ed was Attorney General, Reagan always backed up Ed Meese. And on various domestic policy matters, Reagan listened to Ed Meese.
Mm-hmm.
And I should say Reagan was his own man, and he was certainly not remotely Ed Meese's puppet or anything like that. He made his own decisions. He was very involved in public policy. He was, in my view, the third greatest American president, along with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And I admire President Reagan hugely. But Ed Meese was central to everything that Reagan did, from the tax cuts, which he passed during his first year in office, to the firing of air traffic controllers when they went on strike in September 1981. Ed was central from the White House in judicial selection from day one on.
Mm-hmm.
Every single thing that Reagan was involved in, Ed was also involved in and helping with. Ed helped President Reagan with his Strategic Defense Initiative, which was derided by liberals at the time because liberals thought the idea of defensive missile systems was something out of Star Wars and was simply a fantasy. And in fact, Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative led to the development of the Patriot missile systems that are now defending Kiev in Ukraine and Tel Aviv in Israel. And the whole reason Israel has an iron dome that stops missiles coming into it is because of technology that grew out of Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese's Strategic Defense Initiative. So almost any area of policy you name, and certainly any area of legal policy, Ed and Ronald Reagan were in there pulling together and working together on it.
Talking with Stephen Gao Calabresi, the new book is The Meese Revolution, The Making of a Constitutional Moment. And this moment that begins the introduction of the book is this speech at the ABA in July of 1985. Before we talk about that, briefly explain to us, what was the legal world like prior to this speech by Ed Meese and prior to this introduction of original intention, the jurisprudence of original intention? What was he speaking out against at that point?
Yeah. So the legal world before 1985 was dominated by justices who believed that they should make good policy decisions and that the meaning of the Constitution was essentially indecipherable because it was worded so generally. And so the job of a Supreme Court justice was to make a good policy decision. And during the Warren Court era from 1954 to 1969, the policymaking was very left-wing. Under President Nixon's appointees, the Burger Court from 1969 until 1986, when Chief Justice Rehnquist came in, the Burger Court was still making policy, but in a somewhat more conservative direction. The Burger Court was more conservative on criminal law matters, but on other matters, it did some radically left-wing things. It was the Burger Court that Nixon appointed that in 1973 fabricated out of thin air a right to abortion in Roe versus Wade. And that was something Reagan and Meese were very opposed to, and of which they laid the seeds for its eventual overruling, happily, in 2 years ago in Dobbs against Jackson Women's Health Center.
Mm-hmm.
So the legal landscape before Ed Meese was such that the word originalism was never mentioned once or practically at all. If you do Lexis and Westlaw searches or searches of law review articles, you'll find only a smattering of references to originalism, and none of them are really references to a jurisprudence of original intention or a come to be called a jurisprudence of original meaning. And Reagan had a wonderful Attorney General, William French Smith, during his first term, who was a solid conservative, but in his biography, he never used the word originalism once. And whenever he talked about what judges should do, he said they should engage in judicial restraint. And Ed's view was judges shouldn't engage in judicial restraint exactly. They should interpret and apply the words of the Constitution faithfully to the situation at hand. And if the Constitution left a matter to the democratic process, like abortion, that's where it should be left. But if the Constitution protected a right, like the free exercise of religion, then the court should strike down legislation that interfered with the free exercise of religion. And that, in fact, is what the Roberts Court has been doing over the past 8 years. And it's Ed Meese who planted the seeds for the revolutionary changes that have happened on the Roberts Court in the last 8 years.
Stephen, I want to ask for a little more clarification or at least discussion on that. There's a part in Chapter 5 that discusses this idea of originalism versus judicial restraint because people still don't understand it today. Media members, legal commentators, the idea that originalism essentially means judges shouldn't ever strike down laws. They shouldn't intervene. They should lay back for the most part and let things happen. And that's not exactly what originalism means. Can you discuss that a little bit more in depth?
Judicial restraint is an argument that judges should simply rubber stamp anything that the government does. And it was developed by a Harvard law professor, James Bradley Thayer, in 1893, because at the time, the federal courts were conservative and were in favor of free markets, and they were striking down some progressive and socialist innovations. So judicial restraint got its start really as a liberal idea, and some of Franklin Roosevelt's Supreme Court justices like Felix Frankfurter and Stanley Reed and even Robert Jackson followed judicial restraint. And President Nixon picked up on the language of judicial restraint because the Warren Court had become a very active policymaker in the 1960s. But Reagan and Meese thought that the job of the court was not to rubber stamp what the government does, it was to interpret and apply the Constitution. And if the Constitution left a matter up to the government to regulate, like abortion, and the court should let the government regulate that matter. But if the Constitution protected a right, like the right to the free exercise of your religion, or the right not to have your property taken except for a public use and with just compensation being paid, then the court should enforce that right. And basically, the Reagan-Meese theory was that the Supreme Court and the federal courts below the Supreme Court should follow the law and should be law-abiding. And where the law disallowed something, they should strike the law down. And where the law permitted government action, they should uphold the government action. And it really is a simple belief in the supremacy of law and the idea that judges are supposed to follow and interpret the law, not make it, and not rubber stamp government attempts to avoid it.
Stephen Gao Calabresi is with us. The book, The Meese Revolution, The Making of a Constitutional Moment. Again, this speech in July 1985 in front of ABA, talking about the jurisprudence of original intention. And it's one thing to lay it out and one thing to sort of say, hey, this is the way we should be thinking about cases. This is the way we should be thinking about legal arguments. It's something else to put it into action. What did Meese do, and how did he act to actually lay out and, I don't want to say implement necessarily, but make this a new and coherent philosophy?
Well, what Ed did as Attorney General was absolutely extraordinary, and I would compare it to General Dwight Eisenhower's invasion of Normandy on D-Day. Ed basically fought on multiple different fronts. One thing he did that was tremendously important was that he picked originalist Supreme Court justices and judges, and he therefore ensured that originalism would be represented on the life-tenured federal courts for long after the Reagan administration. And, it's really Ed who was most responsible for picking Antonin Scalia for the Supreme Court. I don't think if Ed hadn't been Attorney General that Justice Scalia would have been picked. And of course, Justice Scalia went on during his tenure as a justice to be a very primary and public defender of originalism, and he wrote lots of originalist opinions. Ed also was behind the appointment of William Rehnquist to be Chief Justice, and Chief Justice Rehnquist was much more sympathetic to originalism and originalist outcomes than his predecessor, Chief Justice Berger. Ed appointed a whole slew of lower federal court judges who were originalists, and he also gave probably 30 very important speeches on originalism in particular areas of law. And he spelled out what originalism would lead to as to the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, the establishment clause of the First Amendment, the takings clause that protects private property in the Fifth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and in the separation of powers and in federalism. Ed was a huge champion of both the separation of powers and federalism because they're a way of dividing government power and limiting government power. And he helped usher in a revival on the Supreme Court of Supreme Court enforcement of the separation of powers and of federalism. And he really is the father or grandfather of the Roberts Court majority. He laid the groundwork for a seismic change in how law is interpreted. And when he became Attorney General, there were essentially no prominent law professors defending originalism in the academy. Today, there are probably 300 or 400, and originalists are still a minority in the academy, but they're a majority in the federal courts, and even the left is forced to engage in originalism to try to counter our arguments. They make bad historical arguments and bad textual arguments to try to mimic originalism and to try to get the policy results they want from the federal courts.
I talked with Randy Barnett a few months ago when his memoir was released, and I asked him this question, and I'll ask you this question, which is there a coherent legal philosophy on the left that exists to challenge originalism? Is there something brewing on the left that would rise to be a challenge to the originalist way of thinking?
The only serious challenge that has been made has been by former Justice Stephen Breyer, who has a new book out. And Justice Breyer argues that judges should be pragmatists and they should look at text, history, precedent, and policy considerations, and they should produce opinions that lead to the best public policy. So essentially what Justice Breyer argues is that the job of a Supreme Court justice or a judge is not really different from the job of a senator or a congressman. They're supposed to decide cases to produce good public policy. But the fact is that judges have life tenure. They're not up for re-election every 2 or 6 years. And they weren't designed to be policymakers. They were designed by the framers of the Constitution to be interpreters of the law and to apply the law. And judges are not very good policymakers for a whole bunch of reasons. Mm-hmm. They don't travel home to their districts to talk to constituents. They don't hold oversight hearings where they hear from experts on the policy consequences of things. They live a very monastic life where they can't discuss their cases with anyone outside of their colleagues and their law clerks. The only information they receive about the outside world comes in briefs, which are highly stylized and limited in the information they can obtain. And the reason judges live in that world is because they were never supposed to be pragmatic policymakers. They were supposed to be interpreters and appliers of the text of the Constitution and the text of federal statutes. And that's what lawyers and judges are good at. They're not good at making policy. And they were never designed to make policy. So that's the only alternative theory that's really out there on the left, and it's a kind of non-theory. And that's one of the reasons why originalism is winning and winning and winning again, because the left just doesn't have a counter theory, and it takes a theory to beat a theory.
Stephen Gao Calabresi is with us. The book is The Meese Revolution, The Making of a Constitutional Moment. One final question. After leaving the Attorney General's office and even moving into a new century, Ed Meese has continued to be influential through his work with the Heritage Foundation, his work with the Federalist Society. Goodness, those are two of the most influential organizations on the right in the past quarter century, 30 years, certainly. How did Ed continue his work and continue pushing originalism forward with those organizations?
Well, Ed Meese is a really extraordinary human being because he was at the center of power under Ronald Reagan for 8 years. And after he left office, he could easily have cashed in and made a lot of money by arguing cases in front of the judges he'd appointed, or by becoming a lobbyist and selling access to government officials. And he didn't follow that route at all. Ed Meese didn't care about money. He didn't care about power. He didn't care about fame. What he cared about was doing the right thing for the country. And so he worked for a fairly low salary for the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institution, and served on the board of directors of the Federalist Society. And he quietly, behind the scenes, kept weighing in favor of originalism. One dramatic moment where that happened was during the presidency of George W. Bush. George W. Bush campaigned in the Republican primaries saying he wanted to appoint Supreme Court justices like Antonin Scalia. But then once he was elected president, it turned out that he wanted to appoint two liberal friends of his to the Supreme Court, Alberto Gonzalez, his White House counsel, who would have been the first Hispanic on the Supreme Court, and Harriet Miers, his second White House counsel, who would have been the second Republican woman on the Supreme Court. The problem was that neither of them were originalists or talented lawyers or even conservatives. Gonzalez is something of a liberal who opposed President Trump's reelection, for example. And Ed Meese met with George W. Bush's White House Chief of Staff, Andy Card, and some other leading figures. And in the meeting as well was my good friend Leonard Leo from the Federalist Society. And Ed Meese basically told Andy Card, if President Bush nominates these Gonzalez or Miers to the Supreme Court, the conservative base in the Republican Party will rebel. And Ed gave Andy Card a list of 4 people who were conservative originalists to pick Supreme Court justices from. And that list included John Roberts, Sam Alito, Michael McConnell, who's now a professor at Stanford Law School and a leading advocate of religious liberty, and Mike Ludig, who at the time was a conservative judge on the Fourth Circuit in Virginia. And Ed lobbied George W. Bush quite hard to pick Sam Alito and to pick John Roberts. And Sam Alito has been one of the stalwarts on the Supreme Court, and John Roberts has been with us more often than he's been against us, and has been, on balance, a good justice. And Ed gets no credit for that, but he not only appointed Scalia and Rehnquist, he also really helped appoint Alito and Roberts. And during the first President Bush's administration, Ed was quiet, and he backed up a Federalist Society member, Lee Liberman Otis, who helped to pick Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court. And of course, Clarence Thomas became, like Justice Scalia, one of the chief advocates of originalism. And Ed was quietly supporting that behind the scenes. And the first President Bush actually picked great judges because he was a good friend of Ed Meese's, because he knew Ed Meese had helped get him picked to be Reagan's running mate in 1980. And so when George Bush Sr. became president, he told his White House counsel, Boyden Gray, keep running everything on legal policy the way Ed Meese ran it, particularly picking judges. And Boyden Gray hired Lee Liberman Otis, an alumna of the Meese Justice Department, to pick judges. And she picked people to be judges who were themselves alumni of the Reagan administration. Clarence Thomas had served under Reagan as chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and also on the Civil Rights Commission. And many of the lower federal court judges she picked had also worked under President Reagan. She promoted Sam Alito from being a U.S. attorney or prosecutor in New Jersey to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And then Bush's son, George W. Bush, on Meese's advice, promoted Alito to the Supreme Court. So Ed was very influential in those administrations. When President Trump came in 2016, he was surprised that he won the election. And the first thing he did is to fire Chris Christie, the governor of New York, as the director of his transition, because Chris Christie had been involved in a scandal called Bridgegate. And Ed Meese and Ed Fulner of the Heritage Foundation became the co-directors of Trump's transition in 2016. And they helped Trump pick a number of conservatives. And then when Trump picked a White House counsel, Don McGahn, who was a longtime Federalist Society member, and when Don McGahn picked Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, Ed led the cheering from the sidelines. And I should tell you that Ed will turn 93 on December 2nd, and he remains very active on the Federalist Society Board of Directors. In fact, we have a search going on for a new president and CEO, and he's on the search committee, and he may be the most active and valuable member of the search committee. So Ed didn't cash in on his time in government service to make a lot of money, and he never cared about the power he exercised, and he took no credit for anything he did. He always attributed credit to other people, but behind the scenes, he was the person who was causing all of this to happen. And even in the last year, Ed and I have filed 7 amicus briefs in the Supreme Court on administrative law cases, but also on cases involving Trump in the election. And those briefs have met a very favorable reception. And it's because Ed's name is on the briefs that the justices read them. So Ed Meese, at the age of 92, is still in there and punching and pulling his weight. And unfortunately, he's physically confined to a wheelchair, but his mind is as sharp as a tack, and he's still having a big influence on public policy today.
Stephen Gao Calabresi is professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, visiting professor of law at Yale, and co-author with Gary Lawson of the new book, The Meese Revolution, The Making of a Constitutional Moment. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you very much, Scott, for having me. It's an honor.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Victor Davis Hanson with Election Insight and Analysis, and Stephen Gao Calabresi, his book, The Meese Revolution. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.